It's Christmas 1978, and you will believe a man can fly. Coming up on the Rewatch, Superman the movie.
Because of the wisdom and compassion of Jor-El, because he knew the human race had the capacity for goodness, he sent us his only son. His name is Kal-El. He will call himself Clark Kent. But the world will know him as Superman. This year, Superman brings you the gift of flight. Superman, the movie.
Hey guys, Happy New Year, and welcome to Random Rewatch. This is Mike, and tonight we are doing Superman the movie. 1978, Christmas time this thing came out. This is the first big budget comic book movie. In fact, this was, at the time it was made, this was the most expensive movie ever made, which is crazy that considering that they did that for a comic book movie. But as we're going to discuss, this movie is basically like three movies in one. I'm really excited to do this. I'm going to warn you, though, I have about twice as many notes as I normally have in one of these, so this is probably going to be a pretty big episode, but it's a pretty big movie, so let's get going with it. So I said this was the first big budget comic book movie. Obviously, there had been other films. There had been other Superman films. There were Superman serials in the 1940s. There were Batman movies and Batman serials in the 1940s and in the 1950s. Obviously, there's the 66 Batman, which was really a television movie, but it was released theatrically, but that was hardly a big budget movie if you've seen that. But in the early 1970s, this film started getting developed. Right around 1973, the Salkinds, who are the producers, started putting this film together. They bought the rights from DC. DC wanted approval on the cast. They had a list of people that they were interested in playing Superman, including Muhammad Ali. They were looking at Al Pacino, James Caan, Steve McQueen, Clint Eastwood, Dustin Hoffman, all A-list stars, all these prime guys in the 1970s. You think about it today, like Dustin Hoffman or Clint Eastwood, these guys are ancient. Yeah, but in 1973 they weren't. You know, these guys were pretty hot actors. So as this thing went through development, they realized that it was going to wind up being two movies. Part of the reason for that is that who they brought on to write this story was Mario Puzo, who had written The Godfather. And if you're familiar with those books and with that film, you can imagine how dense and how lengthy he was with his script treatment. Puzo was paid $600,000 in the 1970s in order to do the story for this film. His script treatment that he did wound up being 500 pages long. And just to give you some context, typically when you're talking about a film, a Hollywood movie, you're looking at about a page a minute. So a typical 2-hour movie will be about 120 pages or so. Puzo turned in 500 pages. So obviously right away, there was enough story in here for them to go into two movies, and what's better than one movie, two movie. Right away, there was the idea that this guy was going to split this into two movies. The Salkinds initially wanted Spielberg to do this. Jaws had just come out. He was kind of a hot hand, but he was already working on developing Close Encounters. They had another guy by the name of Guy Hamilton, who they were looking to direct. He had done a bunch of Bond films. There were a lot of rewrites. They brought in, after Puzo turned in his script, they brought in David Newman and his wife Leslie. Newman worked a lot with Robert Benton. Those guys had written Bonnie and Clyde, What's Up, Doc? And they came in and they did many rewrites on the script. There was a lot of going back and forth with this on the story. So originally they were looking to film this thing in Italy. That was the plan. One of the early things that happened in this film, though, was that they hired Marlon Brando to play Jor-El. And That was a problem with Italy because Brando at the time, he had like an outstanding warrant or something in Italy. So that scratches the Italy plans. Now they move it to the United Kingdom and they're going to film it at Sheffield Studios on the Bond stage. Brando was paid $3.7 million dollars and 11.75% of the gross in order to do this film, which wound up netting him about $19 million dollars. Figure about $31 million dollars in today's money. So it was quite the payday for Brando, considering in fact that he had in his contract that he did not have to memorize any dialogue. So his dialogue was largely on cue cards and in some cases was written on props. When he gave his great speech to his son before sending him off to Earth, and we'll get to that later, the story has it is that that was written on the diaper. So by 1975, 76, they decided that they were going to film these two movies, Superman and Superman 2. They were going to film them consecutively, back to back, basically as one project. And in 1976, they brought in Richard Donner to direct the films, both of them. Donner had done a couple of films, but he was pretty hot at the time. He was coming off The Omen in 1975, which was a huge hit, and they brought him in to do that. Donner would obviously go on to do the Lethal Weapon franchise was him. He would do Scrooged. He would do The Goonies. So he wound up having himself a really great career, although he would wind up getting fired before Superman 2 was completed, and Richard Lester would be brought in to finish Superman 2. A lot of controversy in that. This was kind of the first instance of one of these viral campaigns to release the original director's cut. You know, the Donner cut of the film was eventually released in 2006, which was pretty different from Richard Lester's version of the film, the theatrical version of the film. And, you know, so this would lead us down the road to things that would eventually wind up with being like, you know, Zack Snyder's Justice League, that type of thing. So now they're looking at, now it's, you know, 76, Donner's in, and they're looking at actors to play Superman. Over 200 actors were auditioned for this role, and some of these guys were big powerhouses. I mean, the studio in DC at this point, they want Robert Redford for this. And Donner, you know, Donner's problem with Redford. Well, let me just kind of go through the list, right? They were looking at Robert Redford, that he was kind of the one that everybody was really pushing for, but they had Patrick Swayze come in and read for it. They had Bruce Jenner come in and read for it. They had James Brolin, Josh Brolin's father, came in for it. Perry King, who was a television actor at the time from a TV show, Simon and Simon. James Caan says that he was offered the role and turned it down. But the problem that Donner had with all of these people is that he wanted Superman to be an unknown actor, somebody that the masses did not know, because he wanted the movie to focus on Superman. And his thought was, if you put Robert Redford in this movie as Superman, this becomes a Robert Redford movie. And he didn't want that. He wanted it to be a Superman movie. So, yes, he had to get the right actor, but he did not want the personality of the actor or the notoriety of the actor overshadowing the character of Superman. You know, so from his point of view, Redford's out, Brolin's out, you know, all these guys are out. And like I said, they auditioned 200 actors, and they wound up with this serious unknown named Christopher Reeve. So Reeve had just graduated from Juilliard a couple years before. He had done one big play on Broadway, which he had been cast by Katharine Hepburn. I think he did some soap opera work, but he was, I mean, you want to call it an unknown, he was really an unknown. He at the time, obviously, he did not fit the mold of what we would consider to be, you know, a superhero today. If you look at, you know, guys like Hemsworth or Chris Evans or Chris Pratt or Hugh Jackman, you know, these guys they are a very specific body type, and they, you know, they work out like crazy and they eat, 4 chickens a day and don't even look at bread and whatever. Christopher Reeve was a normal looking guy. He was fit, he was muscular, he's tall, he's obviously very strong, he's a good looking guy, but they were not looking for somebody super jacked like Henry Cavill would be later in Man of Steel. They were looking for somebody who was just fit and somewhat imposing for the time. He did put on, from what I understand, between his audition and the time they started filming, he did put on about 40 pounds. He started working out with David Prowse, who is a British bodybuilder and who was the body actor for Darth Vader in the original 3 Star Wars movies. Apparently, what had really put him over the top in terms of getting selected is he did a screen test with Margot Kidder, who had been hired at the time, and they filmed the apartment scene. That was the screen test. And Reeve knocked it out of the park, and they loved him. And they're like, once he said, the hello, Miss Lane, and just presented himself a certain way, they were like, yeah, that's our Superman. That's the guy. And, I think it was a great choice. He's a fantastic actor in this part. He's really good. He's really sells it. He's really believable. And he draws the line between, like, kind of the goofiness of Clark Kent and the composure and confidence of Kal-El perfectly, beautifully. And in fact, I think one of his great acting moments, and we'll talk about this a little later, is that scene in the apartment where he comes back in after being Superman. He comes to the door as Clark Kent. We're going to talk about how that was done. And she's getting ready to go out on a date with him, and you see him. He's in his suit. He's dressed as Clark Kent. He's in his suit, but he takes off his glasses and you see him stand up straighter, and this kind of confidence comes across him, and it's like he's going to tell her, but then at the last minute he decides not to, and you see him just kind of withdraw back into Clark Kent. He almost shrinks in his stature, puts the glasses back on, gets that kind of goofy expression on his face. So that dichotomy between these two characters, I think he pulls it off really, really well, and I will say probably better than Cavill did. Cavill, there wasn't a lot of difference between his Kal-El and his Clark Kent. Clark was not, a mild mannered reporter. He was pretty big guy and pretty imposing and pretty forceful. Clark in this movie is kind of the nebbish, goofy, clumsy kind of guy that really sets off the difference between him and Superman. So Reeves paid $250,000 for this film, which is a lot of money in 1978. There's no doubt about it. It's a very decent amount of money. Brando, as we said, was paid $3.7 million. Hackman, for playing Lex Luthor, was paid $2 million. Christopher Reeve, who plays Superman and Clark Kent in this film, was third billed over underneath these other 2 stars. Under top billing was Marlon Brando. Number 2 on the call sheet is Gene Hackman. Number 3 on the call sheet is the actual lead character in the movie, Christopher Reeve. As far as locations, we already talked about that. The set pieces, the interior stuff was all done in England. The exterior stuff, New York stood in for Metropolis, and Alberta, Canada, stood in for Kansas in the Smallville sequences. The other big piece of this was the music. Originally, Jerry Goldsmith was hired to do this film, but he ran into a schedule conflict, and it wound up being John Williams. And the score in this is absolutely iconic. There's nobody who does not know that Superman fanfare from this movie. It's just incredible. It's iconic, and even the other themes. The love theme, Lois's theme. And even the transitional music and everything underneath all the action sequences. It's just a fantastic score. Let's get into the movie like proper. The thing that really strikes me about this is that this is really three movies. It's three separate stories that are all kind of woven and put together. And if you count Superman 2, it's actually five stories, basically. But in terms of this movie, it's kind of three movies, it's three sections. The first one is a kind of traditional 70s sci fi movie, one that takes place on Krypton, or as Jor-El will put it, Krypton. Krypton. The second is kind of this traditional 1950s small town film that takes place in Smallville. And then there's the superhero comedy adventure that takes place in the probably like second half, the back half of the film. I don't think it's really evenly split into threes. It's probably like the first half of the film is the first two. The sci-fi section is pretty short, and the part where we've actually had the reveal of Superman is obviously longer. The interesting part is like it's almost what 80 minutes or so into the movie before you see Christopher Reeve in the Superman costume, and at that point it's only for a couple of seconds, and then it's another 10 minutes or so before he actually gets into like doing Superman stuff. So yeah, I mean, you're halfway into this movie before you get to Superman, and that's pretty crazy, actually. So let's dive into it. Like that first, so you got that first section. Each one of these sections represents part of the journey that Clark makes, Kal-El makes, however you want to call it. We're going to call him Clark. It represents part of the journey that Clark makes throughout the story. The first one, he makes the journey from Krypton to Earth. In the second part of the story, he makes, the journey from Smallville to the Fortress of Solitude. And then the third part of the journey is kind of like the traditional hero's journey from Metropolis into becoming a full-fledged worldwide hero. And each one of those sections, kind of makes up the monomyth. If you're familiar with Joseph Campbell and the monomyth, same thing in Star Wars. You have these pieces of the hero's journey. The call to action, the initial reluctance, the acceptance of who he is and what he's supposed to do, and settling into his role as the hero. This story kind of maps out that as well. So you got that initial part, and initially the very beginning of it is really not even part of this film. It's part of Superman 2, where you have Jor-El basically acting as a prosecutor for General Zod, and also his co-conspirators Ursa and Nan, and they're doing the whole anger between Jor-El and Zod, and Zod trying to lure Jor-El over to his side. Something that we're going to see to some degree repeated in Man of Steel, along with Zod's declaration that you will bow down before me, you and your heirs. We're going to see kind of the back end of that story in Superman 2, and then the imprisonment of the three of them in the Phantom Zone, which is really, honestly, it's pretty terrifying if you think about it. The three of them get stuck in this 70s album cover for, eternity if things go their way, and obviously things will wind up not going the way of the Kryptonians. But that's another movie. And then we move on from that. That's seemingly a self-contained story, and without having seen the second film, you really have no idea why that's even in this movie. That's how we start. And then we get off to the second part of the Krypton story, which is Jor-El and his assertions that Krypton is doomed, that the planet will explode, that they need to evacuate the planet, the rejection of that idea by the council, and then Jor-El having his own plan to send his only son off to Earth to live there, and so that the Kryptonians' culture may continue, and they're that's obviously expanded upon in Man of Steel, where there's this idea of the Codex, where Kal-El contains the totality of the Kryptonian genetic code. That's something that's in the 1970s they weren't getting into that. This is just mainly that he's going to be the last Kryptonian, which obviously he's not going to be. But and then there's this promise that he makes that neither I nor my wife will attempt to leave the planet or will cause a panic, which is technically true because neither one of them is going to leave the planet. It's going to be his son. And then as the planet is collapsing and right before the explosion, they launch the spacecraft and off it goes. And one of the things that kind of goes by, but if you think about it, is that this journey is taking years. Kal-El is in this little tiny spacecraft for years as he travels to Earth, across the 28 known galaxies, and you got to wonder what that does to somebody. Obviously, he seemed to be okay. He was in a pretty good mood when he got. I mean, I'd be in a pretty good mood getting out of that ship too. But he was in a pretty good mood getting on the ship. I wonder what it is, the requirement to have a naked Kryptonian baby, because they did the same thing in Smallville, and did they do? I think they did the same thing in Man of Steel. Um, but yeah, so he makes it to Earth. Clark and Jonathan and Martha can't find him. Decide that they're going to raise him on his own, and we are now into the Smallville section. I want to contrast a couple of things though. The speech that Jor-El gives to his infant son as he's going off into space, this idea of you will, I will live my life through your eyes as you live your life through my eyes.
All that I have, all that I've learned, everything I feel, all this and more, I bequeath you, my son. You will carry me inside you all the days of your life. You will make my strength your own. See my life through your eyes, as your life will be seen through mine. The son becomes the father, and the father the son. This is all I can send you. Kal-El.
This sets up there's a very, I don't know, messianic motif to this thing. I mean, think about this, Jor-El calls him, obviously he refers to him as my only son. He also says that he will be the light to show the way to the humans. Then he's sent out basically into obscurity, out into the wilderness, if you will. I mean, Krypton is obviously a very developed culture, a very developed civilization. They have colonized multiple worlds. They've explored 28 galaxies, and even Lara asks him, like, why Earth? They're primitive, and he says, that'll be an advantage to him. He'll be so much more superior than they are. And then he winds up on Earth. He winds up coming to Earth and being raised by a couple who are not his biological parents, a couple who did not have children of their own, who could not have children of their own. It's kind of an echo of the idea of the virgin birth. I'm not saying that Martha was a virgin, but what I'm saying is she was barren. She couldn't have children. Kal-El comes to this couple, and they are chosen, so to speak, to raise him in relative obscurity until the point where he is ready to reveal himself. And that is a very similar kind of motif to the story of Jesus. Jesus is, God sends his only son to Earth, where he is, basically placed with a couple. I mean, yes, Mary carried him and delivered him, but Joseph is not his biological father, and he is raised by this couple in relative obscurity until the point where he is ready to reveal himself. So there's a lot of similarities there between the story of Jesus and the story that they are choosing to tell of Superman in this film. And then there's the speech that Jonathan gives to Clark in really what is one of his like two or three scenes. I mean, Glenn Ford is so good in this movie, and he's in it for so little time. I mean, there's basically the beginning scene where they find him, and then there's basically this scene where he's waiting for Clark as he, is coming home from school, calls him out on showing off, and then gives him the speech.
When you first came to us, we thought that people would come and take you away because when they found out, the things you could do, and that worried us a lot. But then a man gets older and he thinks very differently and things get very clear. And there's one thing I do know, son, and that is you are here for a reason. I don't know whose reason, whatever the reason is, maybe it's because, I don't know, but I do know one thing. It's not to score touchdowns.
The speech where he's telling him that he has a purpose, he has a destiny, he has a reason for being, and he needs to understand that, and he needs to find out what there is. And I just want to, point out like the really significant difference between this movie and Man of Steel, which will come later. But in both films, Jonathan is intent on Clark hiding his nature, but in this film, it's because he feels that they don't know why Clark is here. They don't know what Clark is here to do, why he's been sent here. And to reveal himself before he's ready to would be a detriment to whatever it is he's trying to accomplish. Whereas in Man of Steel, Jonathan's point of view is you do not reveal yourself because the world will fear you and the world will try to destroy you. And it's a very different viewpoint. It's a much more cynical viewpoint, and granted, it's 34 years later, the world changes a lot. And this is what that viewpoint is going to look like in 2012 versus what it looks like in 1978. Clark in this movie then proceeds to go on and prove his father right by discovering what his purpose is and living to fulfill that. Whereas I think Clark in Man of Steel is more about proving his father wrong and saying, no, I don't have to hide. I have a reason to be out. I have a reason to be in the world and engage with the world, and I can do good out in the world, which I think, that version of Jonathan Kent would have probably tried to rail against. And there's also the way the deaths of these two fathers is very different. Jonathan, the heart attack comes on him and he grabs his arm and he realizes what's happening and he says, "Oh no, like I'm not ready. I have, it's almost this feeling of like I'm not ready. I have more to do. I have more to teach my son. This is not the time for this." Whereas Jonathan Kent in The Man of Steel, that tornado's coming and he makes that firm decision like, no, I am going to sacrifice myself to keep my son safe and to keep him protected. And it's a very different death, and the two Clarks react very differently to it. But it's the inciting incident really for both of them to push them onto the next step of their journeys to discover who they are and what they are, and that they're both drawn northward. They're both drawn to this place to where they're going to find out what their destiny is. And so now we get on to the third part of the film where, our guy arrives in Metropolis and gets a job at the Daily Planet where we meet Lois Lane, and Lois is, she is out there. And I gotta say, I love Margot Kidder's performance in this. And I'll say it, she's a better Lois Lane than Amy Adams is, because she really sets herself up as this, I don't want to say the foil to Clark, but kind of the antithesis of Clark. And I think she is a much more focused, much more driven character than was portrayed in Man of Steel. Lois in Man of Steel is kind of, I don't know, she's kind of sad and mopey most of the time, and I don't know, she just doesn't come across this way that Margot Kidder chooses to perform. Interesting, interesting story about Margot Kidder. So they were doing, I want to say it was the apartment, the balcony scene. Um, they're doing one of the early scenes that they were shooting, and she had lost her contact lenses or damaged a contact lens, and she couldn't wear her contact lenses. So Richard Donner was like, "Well, we're going to do the scene anyway. Just do it without them. We'll direct you." And he found out that when she didn't have her contact lenses in, she had this kind of wide eye, like she had her eyes wide open, and she was really trying to to figure out what was happening, and she was paying very close attention to things. And he loved that performance so much. He's like, "You're just going to act without your contacts for the rest of the movie," and that's what they did. He wouldn't let her wear her contact lenses, which is why you've got this kind of openness, this wide-eyedness, which is weird because I used to wear contacts, and if I didn't have my contact lenses, then I'd be squinting all the time trying to see things. But Margot Kidder, for whatever reason, she just opened her eyes wide and was like very intent on connecting with whoever was in the room, probably because she couldn't see them. And that just worked towards her performance, and that kind of shows you that's like one of those things that a director or an actor will see that can really inform a performance. And we get to so we get to see Lois, we get to see Clark, we get to meet Perry White, the great Jackie Cooper, who had been in a billion movies, had a very long and storied career, started out early on in Little Rascals and Our Gang, and just had this great long career. And so a lot of people knew him going into this movie. Nobody knew Christopher Reeve. Maybe not a lot of people knew Margot Kidder, but Jackie Cooper was one of these like kind of comfortable people that people had seen in dozens and dozens of movies, and he's great in this movie. He really does a fantastic job just kind of being Perry White. And then obviously you have, that first big set piece with the helicopter where the helicopter's falling off the building. You've got Clark, looking up, and then you're deciding that he's going to go into action. And I got to say, they were very kind of loose with the rules on how Clark gets into his Superman outfit. Like, he's wearing it under his suit, that's fine, because you see him pull over, they do the gag in the phone booth, with the little half phone booth that he kind of looks at, because, in old school, he would change in a phone booth. And he goes into the revolving door and he's spinning around. I don't understand how that gets him to change, but it does. He can change in the revolving door. But then later in the movie, he just jumps off the building and his suit, his street clothes just disappear. And I don't know if we're really sure where they go. So there's kind of no hard and fast rules as to how he's getting changed and how he's getting into his Superman suit or what happens to his street clothes. So he gets the helicopter. They do the whole, you've got me, who's got you gag. And we set up Lois's, infatuation with Superman that will drive us forward into this movie and into the next movie. And then you have the infamous date balcony flying scene. I mean, say what you want about it, but Margot Kidder and Chris Reeve are great in this movie, and they're great in the scene. This is a really good scene with them together. I really buy their chemistry. I really buy the relationship that they have. The whole voiceover thing when they're flying, the "Can you read my mind?" That's a little weird. Apparently, Margot Kidder wanted to sing it, and there was a kind of back and forth about like she wanted to like sing it on the in the film, like sing it to Superman, like diegetically. I guess this is kind of a compromise as far as that goes, but it's corny. It definitely is corny, but hey, you know what? It was 1978. They did corny things. What can you do? They have the scene where they come back. There's this really cool sequence. It was amazing in 1978. This really cool sequence where they're talking. They're on the balcony. Which, by the way, Lois Lane must be like the highest paid reporter in New York because she's got this $1 million balcony. But that's I guess that's typical of movies. So where they're talking on the balcony and then Superman flies off and you hear a knock on the door and the camera pans and it's a oneer. It's all one shot. The camera pans and she goes to the door and opens the door and Clark is there in his suit. And this was really a tricky shot for 1978. I mean, this was really a crazy shot, and the way they did it was the balcony was rear projection. She was standing when she's out on the balcony. She was standing in front of a big screen, basically, and they were projecting Superman and the city and the trees and everything were all projected, and that was pre-shot footage of him flying off. And then she just walked across her apartment where Christopher Reeve was waiting in his Clark costume to come in. There's a great moment in that scene where she's like off getting ready to go out because they're going out on a date. She's getting ready, and he's by himself in the living room, and she's talking off camera, and you see him, and he transforms from Clark into Superman, takes off his glasses, seems like he grows a couple of inches, gets this confident look on his face and this smile, and you think he's gonna, he says something like, I have something to tell you, and you think he's gonna be like, hey, I'm Superman, and then at the last second before she comes back in, you see him just withdraw into Clark again, and you know, he puts on the goofiness, and it's just a really great acting moment. And I don't know how many people could have pulled that off. Probably a lot of them. But it's so believable when Christopher Reeve does it. If he didn't look the way he looked, if he didn't have the charisma that he had, it would be really difficult to pull moments like that off. The one thing that I thought was kind of interesting, though, is that he tells to her, he says, "I never lie." It's kind of weird because this is a guy who spends his entire life, basically in a hidden identity. The whole Clark Kent persona is a lie, and it's an interesting play off his statement that he never lies. The other thing about it's not weird. The other thing about Superman that's somewhat unique is, so superheroes, especially in comics, superheroes have these secret identities, and the whole arc of Marvel's arc of Civil War in the comic books was very different than it was in the films because the point of it in the comic books was that these superheroes, nobody knew who they were. People did not know that Tony Stark was Iron Man. People did not know that Steve Rogers was Captain America because they kept their personas hidden. People don't know that Bruce Wayne is Batman. And in most of those stories and most of those comics, the the character superhero persona exists to protect the person who is living their true life out in public. So, you know, Bruce Wayne is Bruce Wayne in public, and Batman protects Bruce Wayne from being exposed. Iron Man protects Tony Stark. That type of thing. Kind of the exceptions to this are Superman, where Clark Kent exists to protect Kal-El, not the other way around. Superman doesn't exist to protect Clark Kent. Clark Kent is a created persona to protect Superman. The only other thing, and I'm sure, if you're listening, you may come up with a dozen of them, but the only other one that's really obvious to me is Donald Blake and Thor. Donald Blake is obviously Thor is Thor, and Donald Blake is a persona that is created in order to protect Thor or to hide Thor's identity. Um, but for the most part, superhero personas work the other way around. The person is who the person is, and their superhero persona exists to protect that person. But of course, now I think we really need to jump into kind of the last piece of this movie, and that is the big boss, Lex Luthor. Of course, the great two-time Oscar winner Gene Hackman. At the point of this movie, he was a one-time Oscar winner. He had won Best Actor in 1971 for The French Connection. He would win another. He would win the Best Supporting Actor Oscar in 1992 for Unforgiven. And it's hard to imagine, but sitting here on the cusp of 2014 or 2024, that it's been 20 years since Gene Hackman has been in a movie. The last movie that he was in was Welcome to Mooseport, which was released in February of 2004. 20 years since Gene Hackman has been in a movie. He's done some he's done some voiceover work. I think he's done a couple television commercial voiceovers. He's done some documentary narrations. He's done a couple of things. He was in an episode of Diners, Drive-In, and Dives. Imagine Gene Hackman doing Triple D with Guy Fieri. Um, but yeah, basically he's just riding his bike around New Mexico and writing books and just living his best life, I guess. And good for him. The man's 93 years old. He doesn't need to be doing anything. He's not William Shatner, who's 93 years old and is just keeps going and going and going. As a side, I saw William Shatner last month at the beginning of November. He did an event in Tampa where they showed the Wrath of Khan, and then on the big screen in the Strass Center, and then they had Bill Shatner come out, and he spent an hour talking about his life and his career and basically anything he wanted to, because he's Bill Shatner and he's 93 years old. Gene Hackman's not even putting that much effort into his life. He's just enjoying his life. So he gets $2 million to do this movie. He refuses to shave his head, which is why we have a Lex Luthor with hair up until the final scene of the movie where he let them put a skull cap on him for one scene. You also have, as part of his gang, you have Ned Beatty, the great Ned Beatty, and Valerie Preen as Miss Tessmacher. So, it's really interesting the way they introduce us to Lex. We don't we don't see him at first. It's one of those 70s tropes where you just kind of see the hand and he's operating some controls. You hear his voice off screen, and you know that uh, Miss Tessmacher is in the room with him. She's talking to him. She's looking at him as he's watching Otis, played by Ned Beatty, coming down the subway tunnel with the cops behind him. I mean, obviously, if you're a Superman fan, if you've watched any of the serials or you've seen comics, then you know who's coming. Actually, I think he was only in one serial, but he was mainly a comic book guy. But he was in one serial in the 50s. He wasn't in the TV show at all. He wasn't in the Adventures of Superman in the 1950s. Obviously, he would show up in Smallville, Lois and Clark, those types of shows later on after this, after Superman is kind of brought into the mass media. But before that, he was mainly a comic book hero. But you know who he is, or comic book villain. But you know who he is, and you know what's coming. And I absolutely love Gene Hackman's performance in this. He is so over the top, just chewing up scenery in every single scene that he's in. And he has that one scene That is my complete favorite, where he is, explaining his evil plan to Superman because he thinks he's got one over on him. They've they've found a piece of rock that's kryptonite, and he knows the kryptonite will destroy Superman, and he's got that, so he's not worried about Superman. So he's going to explain his whole plan to Superman for our benefit, and it is just absolutely diabolical, and it is absolutely fantastic in the way that he does
It
it.
occurs to me that a 500 megaton bomb planted at just a proper point would destroy most of California. Millions of innocent people would be killed. And the West Coast, as we know it, would fall into the sea. Bye-bye, California. Hello, new West Coast, my West Coast. Costa del X, Lutherville, Marina del X, Otisburg. Otisburg?
Mr. Smarter, she's got her own place, Mr.
Otisburg?
It's a little bitty place.
Otisburg?
Okay, I just wipe it off, that's all. It's a little town.
You're a dreamer, Lex Luthor. A sick, twisted dreamer. Your plan couldn't possibly work.
I'll admit there were a few problems. Adjusting the precise trajectory of the missile, finding the optimum stress point for the fault line itself. Which, by the way, is target 0, right here.
Ooh.
And his, constant interactions with Otis, with Ned Beatty's character, Otisburg, and, N for nincompoop, all those kind of nitwit, all those kind of things, Otis, it's not that I don't trust you, but I don't trust you. Tell me what you did. It's just great. The two of them are so great together, and I really, really love the way that Lex Luthor plays this. And it's kind of weird that he, and I had said before that this section is like an action comedy, and that's what it is. I can imagine a world in which Gene Hackman plays a straight down the line Lex Luthor, and it would be probably absolutely terrifying. His second Oscar that he won for Unforgiven, his character of Little Bill was a terrifying character, and I could see him, going down those lines with Lex Luthor, and it would be amazing. But they chose to do this kind of fun version of Lex, and I think it works. And I know some people are kind of like, "Oh, that's not my Lex Luthor," but it's my Lex Luthor. I think he's great. I think it works. I love the back and forth between the three of them. He's great in the next picture. He just really takes it on, goes 100%, dials it up, and chews all the scenery that he possibly can. And he just does a really great job with it. And so obviously then you've got this end piece, this controversial kind of final act piece where the bombs go off, which, and by the way, so in the movie, Lex says that he's hijacked 2 500 megaton bombs. So there's no such thing as a 500 megaton bomb. The biggest one, I think, and I did a little research on this, the biggest one I think that has ever been detonated, ever been test fired, is about 54 megatons. The largest one that's ever been designed is about 100 megatons, which is the Tsar Bomba. The Russians, they never built it. A 500 megaton bomb would be absolutely devastating. A 500 megaton bomb dropped on Hackensack, New Jersey, would do quite a lovely job of leveling Manhattan. And initially I kind of was like, well, that would be counterproductive because that's where they are, but they're not, right? They're not in Manhattan. They're in Metropolis, which just looks a whole lot like Manhattan. And, this film does not identify where Metropolis is. It's been in various places throughout the comic history. Kind of the most common one is that it's in Delaware, on the Delaware Bay, across the bay from Gotham City, which is in New Jersey. But it's kind of one of those nondescript places we don't really know where it is. So I'm assuming Lex and his company are quite safe in Metropolis from the Hackensack bomb. And you have these effects which were, in today's day and age when you're watching it in, 4K or even on a Blu-ray, the effects of the earthquake and the flood and the dam, Yeah, they look a little cheesy, but you gotta kind of go with it. They look great in 1978. This was really kind of cutting edge stuff. You know, do they hold up 100%? No, they don't hold up 100%. But I think the charm of the movie and getting wrapped up in the emotional core of this movie allows you to kind of look beyond, the obvious miniatures and the obvious composited shots where, Superman's flying in and you can just tell he's just been pasted in and is moving across the screen. But I do want to talk about the fact that even though they wind it back, they killed off Lois Lane in this movie. And if this is the first time that you're seeing this movie, especially, in 1978, you're in a theater and you're watching this film, the fact that they kill off Lois Lane, that's a bold choice. It was really kind of devastating. Now, obviously, they go and to some controversy, they unwind it. Excuse the pun. Superman flies up, spins the Earth backwards, time reverses itself. I'm not quite sure that's how space time works, but it is what it is. He gets Lois back. It's kind of weird that he reverses time so that all the stuff goes back, but then when he gets to Lois, who has not been sunk into the ground, all of them still remember the earthquake. All of them still remember the flood and everything that had happened. So obviously, did the bombs go off? Was the earthquake still there? What happened to Hackensack? Well, that's right. He had pushed the missile off, so that never detonated. But still, it seems weird that he had rewound time to the point before Lois died, but yet Lois and Jimmy still remember the earthquake. I guess why didn't he rewind it back to before the missiles were launched? I don't know. So did the missiles actually land and he just fixed the earthquake, but Lois didn't die? That's kind of timey-wimey. I'm not really sure how all that works. But you know what? It's good enough. The other thing that I just want to kind of point out is that, we pointed out some differences between this movie and Man of Steel. One of the other big differences, I think, in this movie is that Superman is immediately trusted by the public. This guy shows up on that first thing and where the helicopter's falling, and nobody's freaking out about him. Everybody's like, "Yay, Superman!" And throughout the movie, like he instantly becomes a hero to the point where he delivers Lex and Otis into a prison without a trial, really. And it's just kind of like, here you go, Warden, hold on to these guys. And the warden's like, oh, the world is safe thanks to you, Superman. It's very nice. It's very homey. It's probably a good comic book ending for the time. Obviously, that kind of ending would not hold up today. People will be all over that about, like, why he did that and why would the warden trust him? Why would people trust Superman? You'd wind up with more of people fearing him like you would see in Man of Steel or BVS, but it was a very different time. So I want to go back to where I saw this movie, and this was a Christmas movie. It's the 45th anniversary. As I'm recording this, right around Christmas time, it's the 45th anniversary of this film. 1978. It was a Christmas movie. I think it came out December 15th or so. Movies had longer runs in those days. There were movies that would stay for 5, 6 months in a movie theater if that movie was hitting and was making money and people were going to see it. We didn't have day date releases. We didn't have this thing showing up on pay per view or on a streamer in 60 days or 30 days, and people will go, I'm just gonna, you know what? I'm just gonna wait to see Blue Beetle when it gets on Max. You didn't have any of that. If you didn't see the movie in the theater, maybe in a couple of years you'd get to watch it on your cruddy TV, and that was really kind of it. Even back in 1978, home video wasn't even a thing at that point. So you couldn't even be like, oh, I'll just watch it next year or at Christmas time, next Christmas when it comes out on VHS. That even wasn't a thing. So these movies had a lot of legs in theaters and they would go out. I saw this movie on Christmas Day. I remember it very clearly. My family was on vacation. We were in California. I saw this movie on Christmas Day in San Diego in a movie theater with my family, and we had an absolute great time watching this movie and coming out of this movie. And then, as it was, I didn't see this movie again probably for a couple years, and that was probably on television. I didn't see like a good version of this movie, well, probably until I just rewatched it last week. I think I've seen it on TV. I probably saw it on cable. I've probably seen it in HD. This movie was kind of on TV a lot, and then when HD became a thing, it showed up on TV a lot. But I don't think I've really sat down and watched this movie beginning to end probably in 20 years, if that. I mean, I didn't remember a lot of it. I didn't remember that it started with the trial of Zod and the guy and his guys. I was like, did I put in the wrong one? Is this Superman 2? So it was a great experience to sit down and watch this. If you haven't watched this movie or you haven't seen it in a long time, I would definitely suggest digging it up. It's on Max right now. Digging it up and watching it. So how did the movie do? We always talk about that. This movie did great. It had a budget of 55 million, which in 1978, as I said, was the most expensive movie ever made. It wound up making $300 million in the box office, so almost six times its budget. That's pretty good. Received a bunch of Oscar nominations: Best Editing, Best Score. It did win a special Oscar for visual effects. It was a special achievement in visual effects. It was not a competitive Oscar. It's currently holding a 94% on Rotten Tomatoes. Roger Ebert gave it a 4 out of 5. He wrote, quote, Superman is a pure delight, a wondrous combination of all the old-fashioned things we never really get tired of: adventure and romance, heroes and villains, earth-shaking special effects, and you know what else? Wit. He was very happy with that. He had commented that the Krypton part of the movie was ponderous. He did not like Brando's performance. He wrote, Brando was allegedly paid $3 million for his role, or judging by dialogue, $500,000 a cliche. So obviously he did not like that. Gene Siskel gave it a 3 out of 4, called it a delightful mess. I kind of like that. Cheap, non-flying special effects. He's right. The flying is amazing. Everything else is kind of cheesy and done on the cheap. Generally, there was positive reviews for the film, especially for Christopher Reeve, who would go on to have an unfortunately short but bright career, until he was injured in the horse accident, which happened in 1995. He had a lot of health issues as a result of his injuries, and just kind of deteriorated over time. And then I think in 2004, he finally passed away, leaving behind his wife Dana, who I knew, really nice lady, and 3 children, I think. They lived in upstate New York, well, Westchester County, New York, in Bedford, and I grew up in Stamford, which is the city in Connecticut right next to them. And I had some business dealings with Dana back in the early '90s, and like I said, she was a really nice lady. So that's Superman. Wow, this ran really kind of long, and I would definitely suggest that you get out there and you watch this movie if you haven't seen it in a while. It's going to be nostalgia for you if you haven't seen it since in a bit, and it's going to be, I think, really something special if you've never seen it. And I have a hard time believing anybody listening to this has never seen it. But that's it. That's it for the year, and we will be kicking off next year very, very shortly. So thank you for listening. Have a happy new year.